My name is Kathleen Mercer. I am 71 years old, a retired literature teacher who once believed that kindness was a language everyone understood. I spent my life raising a son, supporting a husband through illness, and teaching other people's children to find meaning between the lines of poetry. Now, in the quiet of my years, I live alone. I thought peace had finally come for me. I was wrong. That afternoon, I returned from the Notary, excited, almost trembling, to tell my son and daughter-in-law that my brother had left me 3 apartments and a beach house. It felt like a small miracle. After a lifetime of modest living, I finally had something to pass on, something solid and proud. The manila envelope in my hands was still warm from the clerk's stamp. The wax seal, deep red and perfect, reminded me of my brother's steady hand, of his habit of sealing everything with care, as if order could protect love. I pressed it against my chest and smiled. On the walk home, the early evening air carried that sweet dampness before rain. My heart felt lighter than it had in years. I rehearsed in my mind how I would tell them. I pictured Daniel, my only son, looking up from the table with surprise. I imagined Claire, his wife, that polished composure of hers, finally melting into joy. I thought we might open a bottle of wine, the one I'd kept since my husband's retirement party, and toast to family, to new beginnings. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, adjusting my grip on the envelope. From inside came the faint murmur of voices. I smiled. Perhaps they were planning dinner. But as I leaned closer, the tone of Claire's voice froze me. It wasn't her friendly register. It was the one she used when talking to her colleagues. Cold, efficient, almost rehearsed. "Just 2 evaluations, Daniel," she said. "She'll be declared unfit. Then we can sell the house." The words landed like ice water down my spine. Daniel didn't answer. There was the sound of a chair scraping the floor, then silence. Claire continued, her voice low, deliberate. "Dr. Melvin said we only need 1 more test. Once she's officially diagnosed, we'll have guardianship. We can pay off the credit line, maybe move somewhere closer to the city. She'll be comfortable, of course. Those facilities are nice." Facilities. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. My hand tightened around the wax seal until it cracked slightly under my thumb. Daniel's voice finally came, hesitant, almost pleading. "Claire, she's my mother." Claire let out a sigh that cut through the room. "And I'm trying to protect you from drowning in her mess. Look around, Daniel. This house needs repairs. Her pension barely covers the bills. We have debts. You have a family now. She had her time." My heartbeat slowed until every thud felt like a hammer against wood. Daniel started, but then stopped. The air between them thickened after a pause. Claire said quietly, "Be practical. She won't even know. Half the time she forgets where she leaves her keys. It'll be easier for everyone." I took a step back from the door, careful not to make a sound. The hallway light flickered above me, casting shadows on the floorboards. For a moment, I thought about pushing the door open, about asking them what kind of people they had become. But something inside me whispered, "Listen." So I stayed. Daniel's next words were softer, broken. "All right, do it fast." The world tilted. For 71 years, I had lived by one rule: never assume the worst of the people you love. And yet, in that small space between the door and the hallway, everything I believed in fractured. I remember looking down at my reflection in the brass knob, distorted and old. My face didn't look surprised. It looked tired. The envelope slipped slightly in my hand. I straightened it, brushed away the small crack in the wax. My brother's voice echoed in my mind. I could almost hear him reading the letter he left for me. "Katie, don't tell anyone about this until you're sure who deserves to know." Now I understood. I turned the doorknob slowly and stepped inside. The hinges creaked, a long, aching sound that sliced through their conversation. Claire's voice stopped mid-sentence. "Oh, Mom," she said brightly. "You're home early. How was your appointment?" Her smile looked painted on. Daniel's face went pale. His fingers fidgeted with his wedding ring. I forced a small smile. "Everything went just fine." The air between us thickened. The smell of reheated soup lingered. The television hummed faintly in the next room. It was an ordinary evening in every visible way, yet underneath, something enormous had shifted. I placed the envelope on the counter, careful not to break the seal any further. "I brought something important," I said, almost casually. Claire poured coffee into 3 cups, the spoon clinking against porcelain. "Oh, what's that?" I watched the steam rise from the cup before answering. "News from the notary. My brother passed on some property to me." Her smile tightened. "How wonderful." Daniel cleared his throat. "That's great, Mom." But their eyes didn't meet mine. Their voices sounded rehearsed, polite. At that moment, I realized there was no one left in the room I could safely tell the truth to. I looked at them both, the son I had loved more than my own sleep, and the woman he had chosen. They looked back with practiced affection, unaware that I knew. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and listened to the faint ticking of the wall clock. 1 tick, 2, 3, a lifetime of faith unraveled between them. That night would change everything. Because while they planned how to take everything from me, I had just inherited something they couldn't measure in money: proof and patience, and I would use both. I sat by the window. That evening, long after Daniel and Claire had gone upstairs, the wax-sealed envelope rested on the table beside me, the red glint of its seal catching the flicker of the streetlight through the curtain. Outside, the world seemed so ordinary. Neighbors watering lawns, a dog barking somewhere far away. But inside my chest, something heavy had settled. It is strange how betrayal doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes softly, like dust gathering on a windowsill, invisible until the light hits it. I used to believe goodness protected you, that if you lived right, worked hard, gave love freely, forgave often, life would be gentle in return. That was the lie I lived by for 71 years. When I was young, I was a school teacher in a small town 2 hours outside Boston. I taught literature to restless teenagers who thought poetry was a punishment. But sometimes, one of them would stay after class and ask what Emily Dickinson meant when she said, "The soul selects her own society." And for that brief moment, I'd feel useful. Teaching was never about the paycheck. It was about meaning. I believed in shaping gentleness into something that could survive this world. I met my husband Michael at 26. He was a quiet man with kind eyes and an army uniform that made him look braver than he felt. When he laughed, it was always with his whole face. We married a year later and built a life from modest things: a used car, mismatched furniture, dinners of soup and bread. I remember the first night in this house, how he lifted me over the doorway just to make me laugh. I thought love like that would last forever. But war and illness have their own clocks. He came back from service older, thinner, coughing too much. I spent years nursing him, memorizing the schedule of pills, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand twitched when he dreamed. When he died, Daniel was 15. I buried half of myself that day and told the rest of me to keep going. Daniel became my reason to wake up, my only boy, my only conversation at breakfast. Every night we prayed together, his teenage voice cracking through the verses. He told me once, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of you when I grow up." And for a while, he did. He worked hard, went to college, and became a financial planner. I told everyone I knew how proud I was of him. Every Christmas, I cooked too much food and he'd tease me, "Mom, you think we're feeding an army?" Those were the years that made me believe I had done something right. Then Claire entered the picture. She was elegant, smart, and confident in a way I admired and feared. The first time she came over, she brought wine and a bouquet of lilies, white ones, the kind that smell like polished marble. She called me Mrs. Mercer until I asked her to call me Kathleen. I remember thinking, my son has chosen well. When they married, I stood at the back of the church watching him lift her veil, his hands trembling. I cried the kind of tears that make your throat ache. It felt like the start of something beautiful. After Michael died, the house was too quiet, and I lived on a teacher's pension that barely covered property taxes. When Daniel asked me to move in with them for company, it felt like a blessing. "It'll be good for all of us," he said. "Claire loves you." At first, it was. Claire was polite, even affectionate in her way. She made tea for me every morning, Earl Grey, 2 sugars, and we'd chat about her work. She was efficient, ambitious, always dressed like she had somewhere important to be. I admired her drive. I wanted to believe she meant it when she said, "We're lucky to have you here." But slowly, I began to notice small shifts, the kind that seem harmless until they pile up. My teacup moved to the far end of the table. My favorite chair was replaced with one that didn't quite fit my back. Claire began organizing my medicine, my appointments, my mail. She said it was to help me. At first, I thanked her. That's what kind people do. They thank others for things they never asked for. Then one morning, my old photo albums disappeared from the living room. I found them later in a box labeled storage. I told myself not to overthink it. Another time, she sold my husband's old recliner, saying it clashed with the aesthetic. Daniel didn't even notice. I started feeling like a guest in my own life. Every decision had to be filtered through someone else's approval. They talked about investments, mortgages, renovations, words that used to mean nothing to me but now carried a quiet threat. Claire's world ran on logic and efficiency. Mine ran on memory and meaning. She believed progress meant replacing old things. I believed it meant preserving them. Maybe that's where we broke. I remember one evening when Daniel came home late from work. Claire had made dinner, something quick and modern, quinoa and salmon. I offered to make his favorite stew, the one I used to cook when he had exams. Claire smiled and said, "Mom, that's too heavy for him. He's trying to eat clean." I laughed politely, but inside something small and tender folded in on itself. It wasn't about food, it was about space, about who got to decide what love looked like. After that night, I started writing lists, groceries, memories, things I needed to remember. Maybe it was my way of holding on. One of those lists said simply, "Goodness is heavy. It is heavy because it demands endurance. It asks you to stay kind even when no one notices. It asks you to love quietly when others love loudly. It asks you to believe that gentleness will be rewarded, even when the world keeps proving otherwise." Now, sitting by that same window, I realized the weight of my own goodness had nearly crushed me. I had spent decades being the woman who forgave, who smiled through pain, who said, "I understand," instead of, "You hurt me." Claire, in her sleek efficiency, was a mirror I didn't want to look into. She wasn't cruel, just practical to the point of absence. She loved systems more than people, and maybe, in her own way, she thought she was doing what was best. But goodness without boundaries is surrender, and I had surrendered too much. The clock chimed 8. Upstairs, their voices murmured, soft laughter, the language of comfort I no longer belonged to. I touched the cracked wax seal again, feeling its rough edge against my skin. My brother's handwriting echoed in my mind. "Don't tell anyone until you're sure who deserves to know." I wasn't sure yet, but I was beginning to learn. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into shadow. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt awake. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. I sat at the table, the manila envelope still untouched beside a cup of cold coffee. The red wax seal caught the pale light creeping in through the blinds. It looked almost alive, like a small beating heart. For hours, I just stared at it. My brother Thomas had always been meticulous. Even as a child, he labeled everything: jars, boxes, even the drawers in our parents' kitchen. When I received this envelope 2 days ago, I thought it was just paperwork about his estate. I hadn't known it would be the last thing he ever gave me. I traced my fingers along the embossed initials, TM, and whispered, "You always did love formality." Then I took a breath, slid a butter knife under the seal, and opened it. The wax cracked softly, like the sound of old memories breaking open. Inside was a letter, handwritten in his careful, slanted script. I unfolded it slowly. "Katie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Take care of yourself and don't tell anyone, not even Daniel, until you're sure who deserves to know." My breath caught. "You spent your life protecting everyone else. Maybe it's time someone protected you. These properties I'm leaving you, 3 apartments and the house by the sea, aren't just for comfort, they're for safety. Keep them under your name, and for God's sake, keep them private. I know how generous your heart is and how easily others lean on it. I trust you'll know what to do when the time comes. I stopped reading there for a moment. The light shifted, spilling gold over the countertop. The air felt thicker, like the world itself was holding its breath with me. I continued, "If you need legal help, contact my attorney, Raymond Holt. His office is in Cambridge. I've already instructed him about the transfer. He's trustworthy, discreet. Use him as you'd use me. And Katie..." The handwriting faltered, a smudge of ink near the edge. "Please, don't let guilt make you foolish. You've given enough." That line undid me. I pressed the letter against my chest. "And let the tears come quietly." Thomas had always understood the parts of me I hid from others, the exhaustion that comes from being everyone's comfort, the loneliness that follows even the most loving families. He used to joke that I gave until there was nothing left to refill, and now, even in death, he was still trying to refill me. I laid the letter flat again, smoothing out the wrinkles. Behind it were neatly folded documents, the deed transfers for 3 rental apartments in Brookline and the title for a small beach house in Rockport. Each bore the notary's stamp, dated a month before he passed. It was more than I could have imagined, more than I had ever owned. For a few minutes, the weight of gratitude drowned out everything else. I thought about the ocean, the smell of salt air, the promise of quiet mornings far from tension. I imagined Daniel and Claire visiting on weekends, all of us sharing coffee on the porch. Maybe this inheritance could bring us back together. Maybe it could heal what time had hardened. Then I remembered the voice I'd heard behind the door the night before, Claire's measured tone, Daniel's hesitant agreement, the word guardianship. The dream crumbled. I folded the letter back into the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. My brother's words echoed in my head. "Don't tell anyone, not even Daniel, until you're sure who deserves to know." I wanted to believe Thomas was wrong about the need for secrecy, but now I saw how right he had been. Still, part of me couldn't bear the thought of keeping something so enormous from my son. I imagined his face lighting up, the way it did when he was little and I surprised him with a new book or a birthday cake. I wanted to believe that man still existed somewhere behind the distance he'd built. I walked into the living room, the envelope pressed against my chest. Daniel was already downstairs, scrolling through his phone, half listening to the morning news. Claire stood by the counter, dressed for work, hair perfect as always. She smiled at me, that courteous, efficient smile she gave when she wanted something. "Morning, Mom," Daniel said without looking up. "Good morning," I replied. My voice came out softer than I intended. Claire poured herself coffee, then turned. "You were up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep?" I hesitated. My fingers brushed the edge of the envelope inside my cardigan pocket. Something like that. Daniel finally looked at me. "Everything okay?" There it was. The question I used to believe meant care, but now it sounded like a habit. I thought of telling them then, about Thomas, about the apartments and the beach house, about the letter that said I was worth protecting. I even parted my lips to speak, but in that same instant, Thomas's voice filled my mind again. "Don't tell anyone until you're sure who deserves to know." So I smiled. "Yes, everything's fine." Daniel nodded absently and went back to his phone. Claire checked her watch, kissed his cheek, and said, "I'll be late tonight, board meeting." Then she turned to me, adding politely, "There's soup in the fridge if you get hungry." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was distant, the kind of politeness that builds walls. I thanked her anyway. When she left, the silence returned. Daniel muttered something about work, then followed her out. The door closed, and the house exhaled. I stood in the empty kitchen, the echo of their footsteps fading. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the letter again. The red seal had cracked, but the wax still clung to the paper like blood that had dried long ago. At that moment, I made a decision. I walked to my late husband's old desk and placed the letter inside the top drawer. Then, on a yellow notepad, I wrote in block letters, "Keep this private. Call Raymond Holt." I didn't know what I would say to the lawyer yet, but I knew I needed to understand exactly what Thomas had done, what protection he had built for me. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window. The wax glimmered under the light, a faint crimson reminder of both love and warning. I realized that the envelope wasn't just paper. It was a mirror. It showed me what I had always refused to see, that sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's armor. I sat back in my chair, holding the letter once more, feeling its weight settle into my hands. Hope and dread braided together inside me. I whispered a quiet promise to my brother's memory. "I'll be careful, Thomas. I won't let kindness blind me again." And as the clock struck 9, I began to believe that maybe, for the first time in my life, my goodness didn't have to make me small. It could make me strong. The memory does not begin with words. It begins with air, with the cool draft that slips under the door and brushes my ankles, with the faint chemical scent of lemon cleaner, with the hush a house makes when it believes no one is listening. I stood in the shadowed hallway, the red seal of my brother's envelope pressed to my ribs like a second heartbeat, and I tilted my head toward the seam of the door. Claire's voice reached me first, clear and careful, as if each syllable had been balanced on a scale. "The path is simple, Daniel. Assisted living, signature, cell. We cannot keep drifting." Something inside me pinched. She was not angry. She was efficient. The distinction mattered. Daniel did not answer. The silence on the other side felt thick, like fabric soaked through. I could hear the soft friction of his thumb worry at his wedding band, a sound I knew even when I could not see his hands. Claire lowered her tone. "Listen to me. This is financial responsibility. We are not villains. Your mother will be safe. She will have nurses, clean sheets, classes, people her age to talk to. We will visit. Meanwhile, we erase the debts. We reclaim our lives." I shifted my weight and the floor whispered under my heel. I held my breath. Claire continued, "We act while we still can. Dr. Melvin already has one evaluation in her file. He said a second exam will confirm diminished capacity. After that, we petition for guardianship. You sign as her only child. We liquidate the house before the roof collapses. It is the sensible choice." My palm warmed against the paper. I thought of the roof Michael and I had patched ourselves the year Daniel turned 8, how he had called the ladder a pirate mast. I thought of the stew I had cooked for report card days, the smell of thyme and bay leaves sinking into the walls. I thought of the piano Michael had tuned by ear when we could not afford the repairman. Sensible choice. Daniel still said nothing. The fridge hummed, the television murmured to itself in the next room. I could hear the pull of Claire's breath. I could almost see the line of her jaw set toward purpose. She spoke again, softer now, as if kneeling beside a child. "Parents who hoard assets at the end of life are being selfish, Daniel. No one says it out loud because it sounds cruel, but it is true. Housing is strangling our generation. We are drowning under loans and repairs and costs they never faced. We are expected to keep them comfortable while our own future evaporates. This is not cruelty. It is balanced. It is time for resources to move to where they can do the most good." The words slid through me like cold metal. I felt the argument land, precise and clean, the way a surgeon might describe an incision. A part of me, the thin analytical thread that had supervised classrooms and lesson plans, recognized the logic. Another part, deeper and older, recoiled at the arithmetic of it. Daniel cleared his throat. The chair creaked. Then nothing. Only that humming fridge, that television, that terrible, gentle quiet. Claire kept going. "We are not taking anything from her. The facility costs $2,000 a month. She will be comfortable. Her routine will be stable. She will be safer than wandering around this old place. Someone will bring her tea at 4. Someone will remind her of her pills, and we will breathe again." I listened to the word safe float across the room and fall at my feet. I remembered a night years earlier when Daniel was 10 and had the flu. I slept on the floor beside his bed, counting his breaths, pressing washcloths to his forehead, whispering stories until the fever broke at dawn. I had not once calculated the cost of rest on the other side. My pulse climbed. The sounds in the living room began to braid together, voice over voice, fridge over television. Then all of it slid under the steady thud in my ears. The sound bridge formed without my consent. Claire's consonants became metronome clicks. Daniel's shifting weight became the soft shush of a snare brush. Underneath it all, my heartbeat grew louder. Thud. Assisted living. Thud. Signature. Thud. Cell. I pressed my index finger to the doorframe, grounding myself in wood grain. I counted backwards from 5 the way I used to teach anxious students before exams. The hallway bulb buzzed above me. A draft curled around my calves. I had never felt this old. I had never felt this awake. Daniel finally spoke. "I do not want to hurt her." Claire answered without hesitation. "We are not hurting her. We are deciding for the whole family. You cannot be a good son and a good provider while the house eats our paycheck. You cannot be everything to everyone. Let the system be the system. Let trained people help. You keep your job. We pay off the cards. We stop pretending nostalgia is a plan." Nostalgia. The word tasted medicinal. I thought of my students asking what the past owed the present. I always told them the past was not a bank. It was a lantern. It lit the floor. It did not pay the rent. I heard my own lessons rewritten now into a ledger. Daniel said, "She forgets things, but she reads the paper every morning. She balances the checkbook." "She forgets appointments," Claire replied. "She repeats stories. She misplaces mail, and if she signs things we do not understand, we are liable. We need authority." I felt heat rise into my face. I had misplaced one letter in January, a charity solicitation that looked like a bill. I had told them, embarrassed, and they had teased me kindly at dinner. I laughed with them and tucked away the sting. Now it returned, brighter. Claire continued, "We do this now, or the roof fails and the property loses value. Be an adult, Daniel. Handle the hard thing. She will adjust. They always adjust." They. I let my head rest against the door. For a second, the grain pressed a faint pattern into my forehead. I could hear the clock in the dining room begin its hourly climb toward the chime. I thought of Thomas's letter, the peculiar mercy of his warning, the way his final gift had asked me to be cautious rather than generous. I had always chosen to be generous. Daniel spoke, barely more than breath. "All right." The air thinned. He added with a small cough that tried and failed to be decisive, "Do it fast." My heart struck once, hard, then again. The sound filled the hallway. For an instant, everything else dropped out. There was only that red seal against my ribs and the drum of my own body insisting that I was still here. Something old in me wanted to swing the door open and demand an accounting, to list the nights I had worked 2 jobs while Michael was sick, the years of casseroles and cancellations, the thousands of quiet, unpaid mercies that had held Daniel's life together until he could carry it himself. I wanted to say that I had not hoarded anything, that I had poured it all out. I did not open the door. I stepped back instead, feeling the cool of the hallway wall against my shoulder blades. I let the house breathe around me. I let the clock finish its count and spill a small metallic chime into the air. My heartbeat softened as the sound faded. Then I straightened my blouse, smoothed the cracked edge of the wax with my thumb, and turned the knob. The hinge gave its long, tired note. I walked in with a smile I had perfected across decades, a smile that said everything was ordinary. Their heads turned. The television smiled too. The room smelled like coffee and detergent. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said. "Good morning," I answered, and set the envelope on the counter as if it held nothing at all. When I opened the door, the first thing that struck me was the smell of roasted chicken. It drifted through the hallway like nothing had ever happened. The table was already set, napkins folded, candles lit, a bowl of green beans cooling beside the mashed potatoes. For a moment, I wondered if the sound I just heard behind that same door had been some cruel dream. But then Claire looked up. Her face carried the same brightness as the candles. Manufactured light. "Oh, Mom," she said, rising slightly from her chair. "You're home. We started dinner, but we're waiting for you." Her voice was smooth, practiced. She might as well have been greeting a client. Daniel smiled, though his eyes avoided mine. "Long day at the Notary?" I placed my purse on the counter, careful not to let the envelope slide into view. "It was productive," I said. My voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. It frightened me how easy it was to pretend. Claire gestured to my seat. "Sit down, Mom. You should rest more. You've been running around too much lately." That sentence, soft, caring on the surface, landed differently in my ears now. It sounded like a prelude to something else, a rehearsed kindness. I took my seat at the table, smoothing the napkin onto my lap. My hands trembled slightly, so I clasped them together under the fabric where they couldn't see. The silverware gleamed, polished to perfection. Claire was meticulous about presentation. She had placed small rosemary sprigs on each plate, a detail my husband Michael would have appreciated. He used to say a table was a reflection of a family's heart, how it fed, how it listened, how it forgave. I wondered what he would think of this one. As they ate, I watched their mouths move. The clink of forks against porcelain became a rhythm, steady, almost hypnotic. Claire was talking about work, her tone crisp and confident. "The firm wants me to take on the Peterson account. It's a lot of responsibility, but I think I'm ready." Daniel nodded, chewing slowly. "You always are," he said. His voice cracked slightly, the same way it had when he was a boy caught lying about a broken vase. I noticed it because I was trained to notice. Decades of motherhood do that to you. You read the subtext, the small tremors behind the ordinary. I smiled, even as my heartbeat quickened. "That's wonderful, Claire. You've always been ambitious." "Ambition keeps me sane," she said, laughing lightly. "Don't you agree, Daniel?" He smiled again, but didn't answer. His fork paused midair. Beneath the table, I pressed my fingers against the wood grain until I felt its texture bite into my skin. It grounded me. The conversation above felt like theater. The actors knew their lines. I had just joined mid-scene, pretending to understand the plot. Claire turned to me. "Did everything go all right at the Notary? Anything complicated?" I looked up, her eyes sharp and waiting. The question seemed innocent enough, but I could sense the calculation behind it. Testing waters she didn't know I'd already seen beneath. "It went smoothly," I said. My brother was always organized. "That's good," she replied, slicing her chicken. "Estate matters can be stressful, especially at your age." I almost laughed. At your age. There it was again, that gentle erasure disguised as concern. I took a sip of water, forcing my hand not to shake. The glass felt heavier than it should. Silence fell for a moment, the kind that stretches thin but doesn't quite break. I could hear the faint tick of the clock above the mantel, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft scrape of a chair leg. Every sound in that room had a heartbeat. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, you seem tired lately. Maybe you should take it easy for a while. Let us handle the errands, the bills." I looked at him then, really looked. The boy who once followed me through the garden, muddy and barefoot, had learned to speak like a stranger. His tone was polite, but distant, his words carefully wrapped in kindness so they wouldn't look like control. I smiled. "You think I'm too old to write a check?" He chuckled nervously. "Of course not. I just mean, you've done so much for everyone. You deserve to rest." Claire nodded, taking his hand. "Exactly. Let us take care of things. You've earned it." I earned it. The irony made my throat ache. Parallel lives unfolded at that table. On the surface, we were a family sharing dinner, laughter, and conversation. Beneath it, another scene ran silently, one where I counted their words like chess moves, where I planned my next breath like strategy. I noticed the way Claire's eyes flicked to the envelope on the counter, the faint crease between her brows. She was curious, but too controlled to ask again. I reached for my fork, deliberately slow, and said, "I might rest soon, but not tonight." Her smile twitched. "You never stop, do you?" Old habits, I replied. She poured more wine into my glass, the dark liquid swirling. To family, she said, raising hers. Daniel echoed softly, to family. I lifted my glass, meeting their eyes one by one. To memory, I said instead. We drank. The word lingered longer than the wine. Dinner ended with Claire stacking dishes, Daniel scrolling through his phone. I collected the napkins and folded them carefully. Routine gives the illusion of safety. As I wiped the table, Claire said lightly, I booked a spa weekend for next month. Maybe you should join, Mom. It'll be good for you. I smiled. Maybe. When she turned her back, I caught my reflection in the dining room mirror. My face looked calm, composed, but my hands, those hands that had soothed fevers, written lesson plans, held coffins, were trembling again. I gripped the cloth tighter until the shaking stopped. Then I folded it neatly and placed it beside the plates. Daniel looked up briefly. You okay, Mom? I met his eyes and saw a flicker of guilt he couldn't quite disguise. I'm fine, I said. He nodded, relieved by the lie. When they left the kitchen, I stayed behind. The room was dim except for the last flicker of candlelight. I sat at the table and let the silence return. It wasn't empty anymore. It was watchful. I thought about the war unfolding in small gestures, in polite questions, in tender traps, in the way love can sound like management when spoken too softly. I smiled again, but this time it wasn't for them. It was armor. Yes, I whispered to the empty room. Maybe I should rest. But rest, I knew, would not come tonight. That night, sleep refused me. The house had never been quieter, yet I could hear everything. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of floorboards expanding with the cold, the whisper of wind brushing against the curtains. Every sound seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were awake, listening with me. I sat at my old writing desk by the window, a single lamp spilling light over the wood. My reflection in the glass looked foreign, eyes sharper, mouth set with an unfamiliar resolve. The envelope with my brother's red seal rested beside me. It felt less like an inheritance now and more like a command. I pulled open the drawer and took out an old leather notebook, the one I had used decades ago for lesson plans and grocery lists. The leather had darkened with time, the edges soft and worn. I turned to the first blank page and wrote, in steady script, The Defense Diary of Kathleen Mercer. The words looked absurdly formal, like something out of a courtroom. But as I stared at them, they steadied me. This was no longer about grief or betrayal. It was about survival. I began to write, slowly at first, then faster. Dinner, March 3rd, 7:15 p.m. Claire initiated a conversation about my mental state, suggested I should rest more. Tone, condescending but polite. Daniel is silent. Claire handled the wine bottle, poured generously. The act of writing gave me air. For years, I had accepted life as a series of things happening to me. Now, I am beginning to catalog them as evidence. Every entry would be a mirror held to the truth they tried to reshape. After an hour, I placed the pen down and reached for my phone. I opened the voice recorder app and pressed record. Entry 1, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. If anything happens to me, this is what you need to know. I paused, letting the silence fill the space between words. I described the dinner, the looks, the tone, the unease. I did not accuse. I documented. That distinction mattered to me. When I played it back, the recording captured more than I expected. The faint ticking of the clock, the tremor in my breath, the steadiness returning to it by the end. I saved it, titled it Defense 1, and emailed it to myself. Then another thought took hold, hesitant but insistent. I needed more than memory. I needed proof that could not be rewritten by charm or excuses. I stood and walked to the hallway closet where Michael used to keep his camera. The bag was still there, wrapped in a thin layer of dust. Inside it, a small digital recorder, one of those portable ones used for lectures. It still worked. The next morning, while Claire was out and Daniel at work, I cleaned the dining room table and, in the process, attached the recorder underneath with a strip of adhesive tape. The act felt almost surgical, measured. deliberate. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. A voice inside me whispered, "This isn't you." Another, quieter but firmer, replied, "It is now." That afternoon, I sat with a cup of tea and waited. When they came home, Claire's heels clicked across the tile. Daniel's keys jingled as he dropped them into the bowl by the door. They spoke about work, dinner, and weekend plans. Normal things. But every sound, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of napkins, recorded into the small device beneath the table. I told myself it was precaution, not revenge. Still, a shadow of guilt flickered through me. Would people call it paranoia? Or would they understand that sometimes when your own child stops seeing you as a person, silence becomes your only weapon? That night, I sat again at my desk, downloading the audio. I labeled it Defense 2. I listened, not out of curiosity, but discipline. Claire's laughter, Daniel's hesitant tone, it was all there, harmless for now. Yet I sensed an undercurrent, a pattern forming in the way they spoke about my health, my forgetfulness, the future. When you've spent your life studying people, you learn to recognize when they're rehearsing. I started keeping every document that crossed my hands: utility bills, receipts, pharmacy orders, even grocery lists. Each went into a labeled envelope. I made copies of my bank statements, printed my will, and stored them in a box under the bed, a small fortress of paper. I also began to take photographs, mundane snapshots of life around me. The pill bottles are arranged neatly by the sink, the mail before it was opened, the date on the television when news anchors spoke in the background. I told myself it was for memory, but really, it was for proof. Weeks passed like this, quietly, meticulously. Claire grew bolder in her small interventions. She offered to take over my finances just for convenience, to streamline things. I agreed on the surface. Smiling the same calm smile I'd worn at dinner, inside I noted every word, every date. Daniel tried to mediate, to soften things. "Mom, Claire's just trying to help," he said one evening. "You shouldn't stress about paperwork." I smiled again. "You're right, dear. That's why I keep my diary. It helps me remember." He didn't ask what diary. Some nights I'd lie awake listening to the faint hum of the recorder still taped under the table. Its presence became both comfort and confession. A line I had crossed, but one I would not uncross. I thought about what my students would have said if they saw me now. The teacher who preached truth and literature, hiding microphones in her own house. But I also thought of something I had told them long ago. Character isn't who you are when everyone's watching. It's who you become when no one believes you. By that measure, maybe I was still myself, just a version sharpened by necessity. One evening, as I reviewed the latest recording, I caught a fragment that made me still. Claire's voice, faint but unmistakable. "She'll sign anything if you make it sound like routine. Just be gentle." My pulse quickened. I paused the file, replayed it, and turned up the volume. The same words again, perfectly clear. I wrote them down in my notebook, underlined them twice. Then I turned to the next page and drew a line across the middle. On one side, I wrote truth. On the other hand, proof. I stared at it for a long time. Then I reached for the recorder, pressed delete, and replaced it with a new file labeled simply The Quiet War. From that night on, my actions changed. My smile at breakfast was deliberate. My words are slower, carefully chosen. I began to prepare, not for confrontation, but for clarity. I scanned the documents. I stored duplicates in a USB drive hidden in the lining of my old winter coat. I called Raymond Holt, my brother's attorney, but didn't speak, just listened to the sound of his office voicemail, steady and professional. "I will reach out soon." Not yet. Each step was small and visible, but in the stillness of that house, I could feel something shifting. I was no longer waiting to be saved. I was quietly building the evidence that I had been here, that I had seen everything, that my silence was not surrender. It was strategy. I called Raymond Holt on a Tuesday morning. His secretary answered first, her voice brisk, efficient, and asked if I had an appointment. I told her no, but that my brother, Thomas Mercer, had left my name in his records. There was a brief pause, the soft shuffle of papers, then a quiet intake of breath. "Yes, Mrs. Mercer," she said. "Mr. Holt's expecting you Thursday at 10. That single sentence carried something unusual, a trace of warmth, or perhaps respect. I hung up and stared at the receiver for a moment, feeling the faint pulse of my own courage in my fingertips. When Thursday came, I took the early bus into Cambridge. The morning light slid across the streets like brushed gold. I hadn't been in the city in years. Everything felt both too fast and too young. People walked with earbuds and urgency. I moved at my own pace. Holt's office was on the second floor of an old brick building overlooking a row of maple trees. The brass nameplate read, Holt & Associates, Estate Law and Fiduciary Management. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. 2 cents I trusted. He stood when I entered, a tall man in his late 60s, thin but steady, with silver hair and a voice that carried quiet authority. His handshake was dry and firm. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, guiding me toward a leather chair. "Your brother spoke of you often." "Thomas never told me that," I replied. He smiled faintly. He wouldn't. He preferred gestures over words. The office was lined with bookshelves, rows upon rows of legal volumes in dark blue bindings. A single framed photograph of a sailboat sat on his desk. Everything about the room felt ordered, intentional. He opened a folder and slid it across the table toward me. Inside were copies of the same documents Thomas had sent, the property deeds, notarized and complete. "Your brother's estate is substantial," Holt said. He left specific instructions that the assets remain solely in your name. He also emphasized discretion. "I trust you understand why." I nodded. "I do now." He studied me for a moment, his eyes patient but searching. "Quiet people are often underestimated, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "That's both a curse and a weapon. The trick is knowing when to let others forget your strength." I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, but recognition. We spent the next hour reviewing every document. He explained each clause, each line of legal protection. The apartments were already transferred. The beach house would finalize within 2 weeks. He advised me to create a separate trust under my own name, inaccessible to anyone else. "Not even family?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Especially not family," he said gently. "Estate law is full of good people doing bad things for understandable reasons. You can love someone and still keep a lockbox." That phrase stayed with me. We moved on to financial accounts. Holt asked if I had recent bank statements. I handed him a folder I'd compiled from my records, the ones I'd printed and labeled for the defense diary. He adjusted his glasses and flipped through them with the precision of a surgeon. After a few minutes, he stopped. "Mrs. Mercer, did you authorize a transfer of $12,000 last month?" I blinked. "No, why?" He turned the paper toward me. There it was, a debit withdrawal labeled Home Renovation. Services, processed through the secondary cardholder, Claire Mercer. The air seemed to thin. I read the words again and again, as if repetition could make them less real. "She has access to your joint card?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Daniel added her 2 years ago when they moved in. It was supposed to be for groceries and utilities. She said it would simplify things." Holt's tone remained calm. "Simplify, yes. That's how most people describe control." I sat back in my chair. The clock on his wall ticked once, twice. The sound filled the space where my voice refused to go. Finally, I said, $12,000. He closed the folder and leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk. "That's not a small oversight. It's significant enough to indicate intention. My advice is to separate your accounts immediately and document everything." I nodded. "I've already started." He raised an eyebrow. "I keep a record," I said quietly. "Dates, transactions, conversations. I record them too." For a moment, I thought he might scold me. Instead, his expression softened into something like respect. "Good. Truth without evidence is just noise, Mrs. Mercer. You're doing the right thing." The words warmed me more than I expected. He helped me draft a letter to the bank, revoking Claire's authorization as a cardholder. He also began paperwork to transfer my accounts into a private trust linked to the inheritance. "If they question it," he said, "tell them you're consolidating your assets for estate planning. That phrase ends most conversations. As he typed, the steady clack of the keyboard felt like music. I found myself watching his hands, the sure way they moved across the keys. Thomas must have trusted this man deeply. Now I understood why. When he was done, he printed 2 copies, one for me and one for the records. I signed mine, the pen firm between my fingers. "There," he said. "Now you control your own story again." I exhaled, not realizing until then how long I'd been holding my breath. Before I left, he offered a final piece of advice. Don't confront them yet. Let them believe they still have access. The moment you reveal what you know, you lose observation. Knowledge is leverage. Keep it close. I nodded. I understand. He smiled slightly. Most people say that, but few mean it. I think you do. When I stepped outside, the sun had risen higher, sharp and golden on the brick walls. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, the city noise a distant hum. For the first time in months, my footsteps felt sure. At a cafe near the bus stop, I ordered coffee and sat by the window. I opened my leather notebook and wrote, March 10th, meeting with Mr. Holt. Confirmed ownership of all assets. Initiated trust transfer. Discovered unauthorized withdrawal of $12,000 by Kathleen Mercer. No confrontation. Observation continues. The pen's ink bled. Slightly into the paper, a dark line spreading like quiet determination. I folded the note, slipped it between the pages of the defense diary, and looked out the window at the crowd passing by. Everyone looked so certain of their destinations. I wondered if any of them were fighting invisible wars like mine. Wars waged with documents and restraint instead of anger. When I returned home that afternoon, Claire was in the kitchen rearranging flowers in a vase. She smiled when she saw me. "You were out early, Mom. Is everything okay?" I set my bag down, meeting her gaze evenly. "Yes," I said. "I just had some things to sign." Her hand stilled for half a second. "Bank stuff?" "Something like that," I replied. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her flowers. I walked to my room, closed the door softly behind me, and opened the drawer where the red sealed envelope rested. The wax had cracked further, small flakes of crimson catching the afternoon light. I touched it once, lightly. "I understand," I whispered again, not to Claire this time, but to Thomas, to Holt, to myself. And I did. The night I left began with a sound I had known my whole life. The hall clock lifted its voice, one soft tick at a time, as if it were winding courage for both of us. The house was rinsed in amber from the porch light. In that wash of gold, dust floated like quiet stars. I stood very still and let the air settle until the silence felt sturdy enough to hold what I had to do. I reached for the small suitcase on the top shelf. Michael had bought it for a weekend trip we never took. The zipper rasped open, a private ripple in the dark. I gathered a sweater, 2 blouses, dark pants, walking shoes, the shawl my mother knit when my hands were younger. I folded each piece with careful palms, the way you fold a prayer. On the desk, the leather notebook waited. Its first line stood like a sentry, the defense diary of Kathleen Mercer. I slid the notebook into the suitcase and opened the drawer where Thomas's envelope rested. The cracked red seal was rough under my thumb. I held it against my heart for a breath, then placed it in the inner pocket. The paper made a small, decisive sound, like the closing of an era. I moved with the hush of a librarian. Identification, bank cards, a tin of medicine, the USB drive hidden in my coat lining, a printed list of phone numbers, Raymond Holt, the taxi service, the police, Caroline from church. I didn't plan to call all of them. I only needed to know I could. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed like a distant road. The dining table stood as it had at dinner. Forks aligned, napkins folded like small wings. I knelt, eased the recorder from the underside, pressed stop, and tucked it into my purse. Above me, a pipe knocked once. I waited for it to quiet before moving again. I checked the front door, then the back, then the side gate that stuck in winter. I wore dark clothes, not to hide, but to keep from startling the night. In the mirror by the entryway, a woman looked back whose eyes knew how to be still. She did not look defeated. She looked undecorated by permission. When I turned off the lamp, the house inhaled. The hallway narrowed into shadow. I counted 5 slow breaths. Somewhere, a car eased past, its tires sighing along the curb. I lifted the suitcase and felt the honest pull on my shoulder. I listened at the foot of the stairs. No sound from above. I pictured them asleep, faces slack with trust. I did not hate them. I named their good qualities silently. He is generous when he is not afraid. She is precise when she is not hungry for control. I set those sentences aside. They were too heavy to carry tonight. I called a taxi and spoke softly. The dispatcher said 10 minutes. 10 minutes to unmake a life. I walked through each room, touching one object I loved, as if formalizing a goodbye. The piano key Michael had tuned to our wedding song. The chipped blue bowl that cooled every stew I made for Daniel. The window latch that only opened when coaxed. The porch light buzzed. I wrote a note, then folded it away. Silence, I decided, would be my only accurate letter. When the taxi arrived, its headlights washed the front steps in white. I closed my eyes and let the brightness soak through my doubt. Then I opened the door. There is a threshold you cross only once. It is not a property line or a floorboard seam. It is a vow. My foot found the first step, then the second. The suitcase wheels bumped lightly behind me. I did not look back. 71 years, one suitcase, one decision. Outside, the air tasted like rain turning in its sleep. The driver leaned over to unlock the back door and looked at me through the glass. His eyes were kind. "Airport?" he asked. "Not tonight," I said. "Downtown, the Riverside Hotel." He nodded, turned the key, and the car rolled forward. The house slipped past my window with polite indifference, as if it had already accepted my absence. I watched the porch light shrink into a small, trembling star, and then into nothing. The city unfolded quietly. Streetlights pulsed like heartbeats over the windshield. I held Thomas's envelope in my lap, my palm resting over the notebook as if it were alive. The driver kept the radio low, just a weather report, a piece of music I half remembered. My pulse followed the rhythm of the tires. I thought of Holt's words. Quiet people are often underestimated. He had said it as a warning and a benediction. In the back seat, I felt both. The glass was cold against my temple. Reflections of passing lights moved over my coat like rivers. At a red light, we idled beside a bakery. A woman inside dusted sugar over pastries, her motions patient and exact. The ordinariness of it pierced me. How many nights had I chosen duty over departure? How many times have I mistaken endurance for love? Grief answered. Permission followed. We crossed the bridge, and the river opened like a dark page. Lamps along the rail threw coins of light into the current. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then began again. The counting steadied me the way prayers once did when Daniel was small and sick, and I sat beside his bed waiting for morning. At the hotel, the lobby smelled faintly of citrus and wool. The clerk looked up with the neutrality of someone who has seen every kind of story pass through the door. "Reservation?" she asked. "No," I said. "One night, Kathleen Mercer." She typed, the keys clicking with gentle precision. "Photo ID, please." I slid it across. She returned it with a small nod and handed me the card key. "Elevators to your right. Breakfast begins at 6. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. Ordinary kindness felt like rescue. In the elevator, I pressed the button for the 4th floor. The doors closed with a sigh. My reflection in the brushed steel looked almost new. My mouth had softened. The quiet in my face was no longer emptiness. It was command. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched empty and blue. Room 412 greeted me with a hush thick enough to rest in. Inside, I placed the suitcase on the stand and took out the notebook. I laid Thomas's envelope on the desk, its red seal glowing under the lamp's light. I called Holt and left a message. "It's Kathleen. I've made a change of address for tonight. I'll come to your office in the morning." My voice sounded calm, like someone I trusted. I sat on the bed, shoes still on, and opened the defense diary. I wrote the date and hour, then the sentence that anchored everything. I left with what matters. I am safe. Then I allowed the tremor that had been waiting to rise and pass like small weather. I breathed until the room steadied. The curtains were half drawn. City lights settled on the carpet in pale squares. From the street below, a siren sang past and dissolved. The heater clicked. A door closed somewhere down the hall. All of it joined the gentle score of a life that had finally remembered itself. I washed my face, then looked in the mirror again. The woman who stared back wasn't brave in the way movies praise. She was something else. She was accurate. When I turned off the lamp, darkness lifted its cool hand over the room. I lay down fully clothed, one palm flat over the notebook, the other over the envelope. Between them, the steady country of my chest. Sleep came when it was ready. It found me already moving forward. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, two things that promised order but never comfort. I sat on the wooden bench outside courtroom 3B, my hands folded over my purse. Inside it rested my recorder, my notebook, and the copy of Thomas's letter. The wax seal had cracked even more since I left home, but its color, deep red, almost defiant, remained intact. Raymond Holt sat beside me, calm as ever. His gray suit was pressed, his voice low and deliberate. "You'll only speak when spoken to, Mrs. Mercer. You've already said everything that needs saying in your evidence." I nodded. My throat was dry, but my mind felt oddly clear. Across the hallway, I saw Claire and Daniel arriving with their attorney. She wore a beige blazer and carried a folder thick with documents. Daniel trailed slightly behind, shoulders tense. When his eyes met mine, he looked down. For a moment, I remembered him as a boy standing beside me at school recitals, his small hand gripping mine, the scent of pencil shavings on his hair. Then I blinked, and he was a man again, about to testify that I was unfit to live my own life. The bailiff opened the door and called the case. Mercer versus Mercer, petition for guardianship. We filed inside. The courtroom was simple, unadorned. A single clock ticked above the bench, measuring out the rhythm of humiliation and truth. Judge Wallace, a woman with silver-framed glasses and an expression that could soften or sharpen at will, adjusted her papers. We're here to determine the competency of Mrs. Kathleen Mercer, age 71, in relation to a petition filed by her son, Daniel Mercer, and daughter-in-law, Claire Mercer. Claire's attorney stood. Your Honor, my clients wish only to ensure Mrs. Mercer's well-being. Recent behaviors suggest cognitive decline, memory lapses, confusion, unsafe decision-making regarding finances. He presented a neat packet of reports, 2 psychological evaluations, a physician's note, copies of financial statements, each piece of paper stacked like a brick in the wall they were building between me and my life. Holt leaned forward. If I may, Your Honor, will address each allegation. Judge Wallace gestured for him to proceed. He started with the evaluations. The first was performed by a Dr. Melvin at the request of Mrs. Mercer's daughter-in-law without Mrs. Mercer's consent. The second was canceled before completion. There's no independent assessment. He placed another folder on the table. Mine. Inside were recordings, transcripts, and receipts. We submit documented proof of coherent, organized financial management spanning the past 6 months, maintained solely by Mrs. Mercer. The judge raised an eyebrow. Recordings? Yes, Your Honor. Conversations demonstrating deliberate manipulation of my client's financial affairs. At that, Claire shifted. Daniel's hand moved toward hers, but she pulled it back. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Mercer, do you wish to add anything? I stood. My knees trembled once, then steadied. Only this, I said softly. For months, I was told I needed help, that I was forgetful, fragile, incapable. I began to believe it. But when people start writing your story for you, there comes a time you either speak or disappear. Claire's attorney objected. Emotional appeal. But the judge held up a hand. I'll allow it. I took a slow breath. My son and his wife say they wanted to protect me. I asked the court by erasing me? The words left my mouth before I had planned them. They hung there, sharper than anything I'd ever said aloud. Even Holt's pen stopped moving. Claire's expression froze, then softened into the mask of reason. "We were only trying to protect her," she said, her voice too smooth, too measured. "She's been under stress. We thought moving her into assisted living would give her peace." "Peace?" I repeated, quieter this time. "Peace built on paperwork and signatures." The judge interlaced her fingers. "Mrs. Mercer, what evidence do you have of your competence and independence?" I opened my purse and withdrew the recorder. "This device contains weeks of conversations, bank statements, and receipts proving I've handled every aspect of my finances. I also possess a legal trust established by my late brother, executed under Mr. Holt's supervision, and I can still balance a checkbook." A ripple of faint laughter moved through the courtroom. Even Judge Wallace smiled. "That last part might put you ahead of half the population, Mrs. Mercer." Holt rose again, his tone precise. "Additionally, Your Honor, Mrs. Mercer has documented unauthorized withdrawals from her account by the secondary cardholder, Claire Mercer, totaling $12,000 labeled as home renovation. The renovations were never completed." Claire's face was drained of color. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "That was a misunderstanding, an accounting error." Holt pressed a page forward. 3 separate transactions, each signed, not a clerical mistake. Judge Wallace looked at the document, then at Claire. "Mrs. Mercer, did you receive written authorization from your mother-in-law for these expenses?" Claire hesitated. She mentioned repairs. I assumed." The judge interrupted gently. "Assumptions are not signatures." The silence that followed was almost tender. Daniel stared at the table, his hand gripping the edge until his knuckles whitened. I wanted to reach for him, but the space between us was now legal, measured in exhibits and affidavits. Holt handed over the final piece, the transcript from the recorded conversation, the one that had begun it all. Claire's voice. "Just 2 evaluations, Daniel. She'll be declared unfit. Then we can sell the house." The judge read the line twice, lips tightening. Then she set the paper down and looked at them both. "I don't think further testimony is necessary." Her gavel rested lightly against the block, as if it too needed a moment before speaking. "The court finds no credible evidence of incompetence. The petition for guardianship is denied. Mrs. Mercer retains full authority over her estate and person. Petitioners are advised to refrain from further interference." The sound that followed was not applause. It was relief. It was the collective exhale of dignity returned. As the clerk stamped the papers, the red ink bled across the page. Rejected. I stared at that word, watching it dry. It looked like justice spelled in past tense. Claire's lawyer gathered his files without meeting my eyes. She stood, rigid, color rising to her face. Daniel looked at me once, just once, and I saw in his eyes not anger, but something heavier. Shame. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. The power of silence is its precision. It needs no decoration. Outside, the morning light broke through the courthouse windows, pale and forgiving. Holt turned to me as we walked down the steps. "You handled yourself well, Mrs. Mercer." "I only told the truth," I said. He smiled. "That's rarer than it should be." We stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The city moved around us. Taxis, voices, the rustle of people living ordinary days. I tightened my grip on my purse, feeling the familiar shape of the recorder inside. The paper had nearly erased me. But now, the paper has restored me. I turned my face toward the sun, let the warmth reach the corners of my eyes, and said quietly, "It's over." Then Holt shook his head. "No, Mrs. Mercer. It's only just begun." 2 days after the verdict, the house was still. I had returned only to gather what was mine, though the walls seemed to question my decision with every creak. The scent of polish lingered, faint and artificial, as if the house had tried to clean itself of the trial. The red, rejected stamp still lived in my mind, bright, merciless, final. Raymond Holt had offered to arrange movers, but I declined. There are some closures that require your own hands. I wanted to touch each thing one last time. I folded my husband's photographs into a box, ran my fingers along the grain of the dining table, and paused at the empty space where my piano once stood. Claire had moved it weeks earlier, saying the room needed air. I smiled at the irony. The air felt breathable now. Outside, the afternoon was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries both ending and mercy. The light came through the window like forgiveness might if it had shape. That was when I heard the knock. 3 short taps, hesitant. I knew the rhythm before I saw him. Daniel had always knocked that way as a boy. 3 beats, pause, then 1 soft follow-up, as though the 4th belonged to me. I opened the door. He stood there on the porch, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes low. Claire hovered behind him on the walkway, arms folded tight, face unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the wind moved, the faint rustle of the oak leaves, the far-off sound of a lawnmower, the clock behind me marking each second as evidence that time was moving on. Daniel's voice broke the silence. "Mom, I wanted to come, to explain." I stepped aside. "Then explain." He looked past me into the house, then back at the ground. "We never meant to hurt you. We thought we were helping." I waited. Silence can be merciful or sharp. That day, it was both. Claire took a small step forward. "It got out of hand. We were scared, that's all. You seemed confused sometimes, forgetting appointments, Langta things." I let her words land without interruption. It was strange how easily the same tone that once disarmed me now sounded hollow. "I forgot nothing that mattered," I said finally. Daniel's eyes lifted. "I know that now. The recordings, the papers. You made your point, but you didn't have to go that far. You could have just told us." I looked at my son, the man who had once cried because a broken toy seemed unfixable. How could I explain that sometimes truth needs witnesses stronger than love? "You wouldn't have heard me," I said gently. "You were too busy protecting the version of me that fit your story." He swallowed hard. "Mom, please. I just want us to move past this." Behind him, Claire exhaled sharply, impatient like a woman enduring a conversation she had already outgrown. Her silence was her defense, her shape of pride. I studied them both, their distance, their discomfort, their youth, shining like armor. And then, to my own surprise, I felt no hatred, just the quiet ache of recognition. "Daniel," I said, my voice calm, measured, "I hope one day you'll understand what love without power looks like." He frowned, as if the sentence were in another language. "Love without power, Bensei," I repeated softer. "It doesn't control, it doesn't decide for someone. It trusts. Even when it disagrees, that's what I gave you, and what you forgot to give back." His mouth opened to argue, then closed. He stared at the porch rail, the paint chipped from years of weather. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I said. "Understanding takes longer than apology." For a second, I thought he might reach for me. Instead, he took a half step backward, eyes wet, but restrained. Claire touched his arm. Her gaze met mine only briefly, polite and distant, like 2 women in a waiting room acknowledging each other's pain without comment. "Take care of yourself," she said. "I always have," I answered. The wind shifted. A leaf detached from the oak tree and landed at Daniel's feet. He bent down, picked it up, then let it fall again. "Will you ever come back?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "Not to this version of home." He nodded, once, sharply. "Then I guess this is goodbye." "No," I said, "just distance. Sometimes that's the only way people learn how to see." He looked as if he wanted to argue, but he didn't. They turned together toward the car. Claire's heels clicked down the walkway. Daniel followed a few paces behind. I watched them without bitterness, only awareness. The life I had built for them had, finally, outgrown me, and I was done asking for space in rooms I once paid for. When they reached the car, Daniel turned one last time. His lips moved, forming words I could not hear. Maybe sorry, maybe thank you, maybe nothing at all. I stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and leaned my forehead against the wood. The cool grain steadied me. The silence that followed was deep, but not empty. It was mine. I turned the lock. The metal latch clicked into place. a sound small enough to be missed by anyone outside, but to me it rang like punctuation at the end of a long, unwieldy sentence. That single click became the sound of release, of boundaries restored, of years of quiet servitude folding neatly into closure. For a long while I stood there breathing. The echo of their footsteps faded from the driveway. The clock in the hallway resumed its soft rhythm. I walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the late light bent through the oak branches, breaking into patterns across the floorboards. Everything glowed in amber, a color both fragile and forgiving. I brewed tea, not for habit, but for ritual. The steam rose in curls that blurred the world beyond the glass. I sat at the table where the recorder had once lived and traced my fingers over the wood. It no longer felt like evidence. It felt like history. The cup warmed my palms. The ache in my chest eased into something quieter, a grief without edges. I thought of Thomas, of his letter, of Holt's words. Quiet people are often underestimated. He had been right. I didn't win by shouting. I won by staying whole. As dusk gathered, I turned off the light, leaving only the clock's faint tick. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a witness that could finally rest. When I climbed the stairs to my room, the floor creaked underfoot. An old, familiar complaint. I smiled at the sound. Not everything needs to be fixed to be trusted. I reached the top step, looked back once, not at the door, not at the memory of them, but at the space I had reclaimed. Then I whispered to the air, almost a prayer, "It's all right now." And in the quiet that followed, I believed it. The first morning at the beach house felt like breathing for the first time after holding my breath for 71 years. The light came differently there, softer, as though the sun itself understood restraint. The air smelled of salt and pine, carrying both sharpness and promise. When I opened the windows, the wind moved through the curtains like a visitor finally welcomed home. The house was small, built with the kind of care that leaves fingerprints in the wood. My brother had chosen well. 2 bedrooms, whitewashed walls, shelves filled with books he never returned to, and a porch that looked straight out at the Atlantic. Every piece of it seemed to whisper, "You are safe here." I set my suitcase down and stood for a while, just listening. The sea breathing in and out, the seagulls calling across the dunes, the occasional snap of grass in the breeze. The sound was alive, but kind. For so long, silence in my life had meant danger. Words withheld, emotions measured, truths concealed. But here, silence had changed its shape. It was no longer a weapon. It was refuge. I spent that first hour cleaning not because it needed it, but because it grounded me. I dusted the windowsills, rinsed the teacups, and folded the blankets. Ordinary motions, the choreography of recovery. In the corner of the living room sat an old armchair upholstered in faded blue fabric. I sank into it and let my shoulders drop for the first time in months. The ocean glittered beyond the porch railing, a vast field of silver moving without permission from anyone. I thought of Thomas and what he must have felt, sitting here years ago, writing the letter that would save me from my own blindness. His handwriting had always been even, patient. Take care of yourself and don't tell anyone, not even Daniel, until you're sure who deserves to know. Now finally, I understood every word. As I made tea, a knock sounded at the door. I hesitated. I hadn't told anyone I was here, not even Raymond Holt. For a second, I wondered if distance could ever truly guarantee peace. When I opened the door, a woman stood there holding a small basket of lemons. Her hair was white but thick, gathered into a careless bun. She wore a cardigan the color of sea foam and a look of quiet amusement. "New neighbor," she said, her voice warm but textured. "I saw the lights on last night, thought I'd stop by before the gulls claim you as one of their own." I smiled, stepping aside. "That's kind of you. Please, come in." She walked with the steadiness of someone who had decided long ago not to rush for anyone. "Eliza Warren," she said, setting the basket on the counter. "My husband used to fish off the rocks down there. After he passed, I decided to stay. The sea knows how to hold grief better than people do." I poured tea for both of us. "I'm Kathleen." She looked around the room. "Ah, you're Thomas Mercer's sister. I remember him, always out early with his coffee, never missed a sunrise." Her words folded around me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. "He was that kind of man," I said softly. We carried the cups out to the porch. The boards creaked beneath our feet in rhythm with the tide. We sat in wicker chairs facing the horizon. The sea was pale blue, mottled with white where the wind touched it. Eliza studied me for a moment, then said, "You walk like someone who has survived a war she never declared." I turned to her, caught between laughter and tears. "Maybe I did." She nodded, as though she already knew. "It shows in the shoulders. People who've had to be calm for too long, they carry it there." I took a slow sip of tea, the warmth filling the hollow space just under my ribs. "I suppose I've been calm enough to last 2 lifetimes. "Then you're due for the opposite," she said. "Don't mistake stillness for peace. Sometimes healing makes noise." We sat for a while without speaking. The waves folded over themselves in patient applause. A sailboat moved across the horizon, so small it looked almost painted on the sky. Eliza broke the silence again, gently. "You don't have to tell me what happened, but I can see you came here to remember who you are." "I think I came here to stop being what everyone else wanted me to be," I said. "Same thing," she replied. The simplicity of her answer settled something in me. We talked about unimportant things after that. The weather, the stubbornness of the gulls, the price of tea in town. She told me about her garden and the way salt killed most flowers except the stubborn ones. I told her about teaching, about my students who thought literature was punishment until it saved them. Each story was an offering. When the pot ran dry, she stood. "I'll bring you some herbs tomorrow. Mint, rosemary, things that forgive neglect." "Thank you," I said. She smiled, eyes narrowing kindly. "You'll fit in fine here, Kathleen. This place likes quiet people who know how to listen." After she left, I sat alone again, the sea still moving steadily before me. I thought about what she had said. "You walk like someone who survived a war she never declared." She was right, but she had missed one thing. I had also won it. The realization came without triumph. It was soft, almost tender. Winning for me wasn't about conquering anyone. It was about reclaiming the version of myself that no longer needed permission to exist. As evening approached, the sky shifted to rose and gold. The air turned cooler, smelling faintly of salt and cedar. I made another cup of tea and carried it outside. The porch light flickered on automatically, and in its glow, the steam from my cup curled upward like a small spirit rising. I wrote the day's entry in the defense diary. April 4th, I arrived at the beach house. The sea is louder than I remember, but kinder. Met Eliza Warren, widow. Offer lemons and conversation. Her words, "You walk like someone who survived a war she never declared." I answered, "Maybe I did." For once, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I closed the notebook and placed it on the railing beside me. The ocean continued its slow monologue. Every wave seemed to erase something unnecessary from my memory. An argument, a bruise, a silence too long sustained. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think of the future not as a calendar of duties, but as an open shoreline. Maybe I'd take up painting again. Maybe I'd volunteer at the library in town. Maybe I'd just keep walking the sand until my footsteps stopped needing to prove I existed. When night finally came, the stars hung low and close, reflected in the restless black water. I whispered a thank you to Thomas, to the sea, to the version of myself that hadn't given up. Eliza's words echoed in my mind, almost musical now. "You walk like someone who survived a war she never declared." I smiled, lifting my cup toward the horizon. "And maybe," I whispered back, "I finally learned how to live afterward." The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. No return address, just my name in handwriting I had known since before Daniel could tie his shoes. The ink had bled slightly along the edges, as though the words had traveled through hesitation to reach me. I found it wedged between a gardening catalog and a bill. My first instinct was to set it aside, to let time decide whether I was ready, but something in the way my name curved, Mom, not mother, made my hands tremble. I took it to the porch. The sea was restless that day, pushing white foam across the rocks as though rehearsing how to erase footprints. I opened the envelope. Inside, one page. No preamble, no apology written for performance. Just Daniel, naked in his words. Mom, I don't know how to start except to say I'm sorry. Everything I did was out of fear, though I see now that fear is just pride with a trembling voice. Claire and I thought we were protecting you, but I realized we were protecting ourselves. From guilt, from losing control, from admitting we never really saw you as a person, only as the idea of mom. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know that I understand now. And I'm sorry for the silence after the trial. It wasn't anger, it was a shame. I love you. Always have. Always will. Daniel. I read it twice, each time slower. The wind lifted one corner of the paper like it wanted to take it. My eyes burned, but not with tears, with memory. I remembered the boy who used to leave notes under my pillow when he was small, drawings of stick figures holding hands, smiling under crooked suns. I used to keep them all in a tin box until the paper yellowed. Somewhere along the way, the notes stopped coming, replaced by silence, by the polite efficiency of adulthood. Now, decades later, another note had found its way back to me. But I didn't cry. I folded the letter, pressed it flat, and held it against my chest for a long moment. The heartbeat underneath was slow, deliberate. It didn't ask for anything, not revenge, not reconciliation, just the truth. Inside the house, I went to the small wooden drawer in the desk where I kept the defense diary and Thomas's will. I untied the red ribbon and laid the documents out carefully. The wax-sealed envelope had become brittle at the corners. I placed Daniel's letter on top, smooth as a confession. Then I tied the ribbon again, tighter this time. Forgiveness doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it just needs distance. That sentence formed itself in my mind, as clear as a psalm. I whispered it aloud, testing how it sounded in the room. Forgiveness doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it just needs distance. The words stayed there, floating in the light. They didn't echo. They settled. I didn't write him back. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to reopen a wound that had finally learned how to scar properly. Silence, I realized, can be a kind of mercy. When love stops being mutual, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop tugging at its ghost. That afternoon, I walked down to the shore. The sea had calmed. The air was soft with salt and memory. I sat on a rock and let the foam brush against my shoes. I thought about mothers who never get their apologies, and sons who never get their answers, about how every generation believes it's doing its best, and sometimes best is just a synonym for blind. I picked up a small shell and turned it in my hand. Its spiral was perfect, proof that beauty doesn't need symmetry, just persistence. That night, I made tea with Eliza. She didn't ask about the letter, though I think she knew. Some things show in the eyes before they show in the words. We sat outside as the sky deepened into indigo. The porch light hummed faintly. Eliza poured another cup and said, "You look lighter tonight." "I think I'm learning the difference between peace and closure," I said. She smiled. "And?" "Peace doesn't need anyone else in the room." She nodded slowly, approvingly. "That's the hard kind." We drank in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty anymore. It was spacious, generous, like forgiveness itself. Later, after she left, I wrote another entry in my diary. April 12th, Daniel's letter arrived. Words weighed in sincerity, but carried by the same fear that once blinded him. I read, I understood, I chose quiet. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's the decision to live without needing an apology to make sense of what happened. I hope he finds peace in his own silence. I already have. I placed the notebook beside my bed, turned off the lamp, and lay listening to the ocean. The tide came and went like breath, reminding me that everything, pain, guilt, even love, must ebb to make room for something new. In the days that followed, I noticed changes too small for anyone else to see. I stopped checking the mail at dawn. I started planting rosemary outside the porch. I learned to sleep without replaying voices behind doors. The beach house began to smell of lemon and mint, of beginnings rather than aftermath. Sometimes I'd sit at the window and imagine Daniel standing at his own doorway, somewhere far away, holding his pen again, wondering whether I'd forgiven him. Maybe he'd never know. Maybe that was the point. Because forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about handing someone your peace. It was about reclaiming it quietly and keeping it safe. A few nights later, I received a message from Eliza, short and tender. Low tide tonight. The stars look close enough to touch. Come watch. We stood by the water's edge, our feet half buried in cool sand, the sky stretched endless above us. I used to think forgiving meant losing, I said. Eliza glanced at me, the moonlight touching her face. It means winning differently. We both watched the sea pull back, revealing 1,000 shells glinting under the stars. I smiled. Maybe I'll write to him one day. Maybe, she said, but you already answered. Her words followed me home like the tide returning. That night, before bed, I untied the red ribbon once more, just long enough to slip Daniel's letter beneath the will. Then I tied it again and placed it in the drawer. Not hidden, just resting. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the sea through the half-open window. It wasn't calling or accusing anymore. It was simply breathing. And I breathed with it, steady, free, forgiven in all directions. The evening light came in ribbons of gold and coral, stretching over the water until it looked like the horizon itself was exhaling. It had been 3 months since the letter. 3 months of slow mornings and quiet nights. The beach house no longer felt borrowed. It felt lived in, worn gently by time and peace. The books had shifted from shelves to tables, marked by pages I actually read. The kettle whistled at the same hour each afternoon, like a heartbeat reminding me that stillness was its own rhythm. That day, the sea was calm, the kind of calm that arrives only after a storm has already taken everything it wanted. The air smelled of salt and sun-warmed wood. I carried a small rose sapling out onto the porch, its roots wrapped carefully in a burlap cloth. The local nursery owner had asked if I wanted something easier to keep alive, something less fragile. I told her I didn't want it easy. I wanted something that bloomed only when it trusted the earth again. I dug a small hole in the sand just beyond the porch railing, where the wind brushed gently but didn't bite. My hands sank into the soil, cool and damp. Each handful felt like rewriting the story of my own care. As I pressed the roots down and patted the earth around them, I thought of every version of myself that had once believed endurance meant silence. Every year, I spent cushioning other people's storms while calling it love. Every night, I stayed awake, listening to walls that no longer answered. The rosebush stood upright, its stem trembling slightly in the breeze. A single bud hung near the top, half closed, the color of faded blush, not yet ready to open, but alive. I brushed the dirt from my palms and sat back on the step. The light touched everything with equal mercy, my face, the porch, the tiny rose. The sea glittered as though applauding the effort. Some people rebuild with noise, others with roots. The sentence rose in my mind, uninvited but perfect. It sounded like something Thomas might have said if he'd been there watching me through. His old glasses, smiling that quiet smile that made everything seem already understood. I said it aloud, softly, just to hear it in the air. Some people rebuild with noise, others with roots. The wind carried it out toward the waves, as if agreeing. Inside the house, the drawer still held the red ribbon bundle, the will, the diary, the letter. But I hadn't opened it in weeks. The past didn't ask for my attention anymore. It only nodded from afar, grateful I'd finally stopped kneeling before it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single brass key. The key to my old house, the one Daniel and Claire still lived in, at least for now. It felt lighter than I remembered, as though the metal had learned how to forgive. For a long moment, I rolled it between my fingers. Its edges were worn smooth, shaped by decades of doors opened and closed, by mornings of coffee and nights of waiting. I stood and walked toward the shore. The sand gave way beneath my feet with that familiar, soft resistance that only the sea understands. The tide was inching closer, calm but determined. When I reached the edge of the water, I crouched down. The foam touched my fingertips like an old friend testing boundaries. I looked at the key again. Small, ordinary, unremarkable to anyone but me. Yet in its weight lived every chapter I'd outgrown. The dinners endured in silence, the slammed doors, the empty chair where my husband once sat, the laughter that became caution, the motherhood that turned into management. I closed my fist around it and whispered, "Thank you for everything you unlocked and everything you couldn't." Then I threw it. It arced through the air, a flicker of gold against the setting sun, and disappeared into the waves. The sound it made, just a small splash, was almost nothing. But I felt it all the way to my bones. The sea accepted it without ceremony. It always does. I stayed there until the horizon turned lavender and the first stars began to appear. My reflection shimmered on the water's surface. Older, yes, but unburdened. The tide came in a little closer, brushing against my shoes, as if to remind me, everything you let go of returns as calm. When I finally turned back toward the house, the porch light had flicked on automatically. Its glow spilled softly across the sand, leading the way like memory without pain. Eliza's voice drifted faintly from next door, humming some old tune about time and mercy. I smiled. She would come by tomorrow with her herbs and her patient humor. We would drink tea and talk about nothing and everything, and maybe she'd tell me the roses were coming in well this year. I walked past the young rose bush, now casting a small, brave shadow in the moonlight. I knelt beside it and touched its stem gently. The bud had opened just a little more, enough to show a glimpse of pink. "Take your time," I whispered. "You're safe now." The sea answered with a sigh. Inside, I lit a single candle. Its flame flickered softly against the walls, throwing gentle shapes that moved like memory but didn't linger. I wrote one last entry in the defense diary. May 7th. I planted a rose bush today, threw away the last key. I think redemption is quieter than people imagine. It doesn't announce itself. It just starts breathing again. I didn't lose a family. I found myself. I closed the notebook, placed it on the table beside the candle, and exhaled. The sound of the waves reached through the open window, low and endless, a kind of music you could only hear when you stopped trying to control it. A piano melody played softly in my head, slow, tender, without crescendo. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the last light fade into night. The sea stretched out before me, dark and alive, holding every secret without needing to explain any of them. There was no applause, no witnesses, no grand victory, just me, the sound of water against the shore, and the quiet bloom of something I thought I'd lost. Peace. The tide rolled in once more, steady as breath, and in that moment, between the hush of waves and the hum of the world settling into darkness, I understood that beginnings and endings are sometimes the same thing. I smiled, closed my eyes, and let the music of the sea play me out.